Here we go. So welcome to Mass Creative's Virtual and Policy Action Update. It is September 10th, 2021. Happy post-Labor Day. Happy Rosh Hashanah to those who follow the Jewish faith. And we got a lot going on. So let's get going. So let's start with the federal. So over the little period of time where we didn't meet between the month of August, things still happened, including the Creative Economy Revitalization Act. So this is an act that was proposed by Rep. Ledger Fernandez and Rep. Obernolte. And it is basically it is in the same tradition as the Works Project Administration and then CETA, which happened in the 70s, which is about getting creative workers back to work. And it would create one of the sort of the big pieces is it would use 300 million of federal dollars to create direct grants and commissions to artists and creative workers nationwide. This includes things like free concerts, large scale murals, photography exhibits, and performances. But bottom line, it is about getting artists back to work, getting creative workers back to work. And Mass Creative thinks that this is a really important component of our entire recovery strategy here. And so it's one of the reasons that we endorsed the bill. And we're asking you to write your members of Congress in support of the bill, right? Like, yes, the Massachusetts congressional delegation tends to be very supportive on these issues, but that doesn't mean we should take that for granted. And so we've included a link to an action alert that's being put out by Be an Arts Hero, which is a nationwide movement to unite creative workers together. And you can use their little action alert. It's just as easy as ours, but write to your member of Congress now and say you support this bill and you want to see it happen. So that's what's happening on the federal level immediately. So let's turn to the state, because this is where I have been putting a lot of energy, and the staff at Mass Creative, G and Alex, we've all been paying attention to this. So the American Rescue Plan Act. So back in the summer, we held a American Rescue Plan Act teach-in to sort of tell you everything what that act did, the sheer amount of money that was coming to Massachusetts in terms of fiscal recovery funds to the state, to cities and towns, and to counties. And we have all of that information, including a recording of that webinar on our website. But I said, like, get ready, like it's happening, and we got to be organized and we got to be loud about this when the time is right. So yesterday, the Joint Committee on Ways and Means and the House Committee on Federal Stimulus and Census Oversight held a hearing. It was I believe it was the third in a series of hearings that they're having to get public comment and to get feedback around the uses of that American Rescue Plan Act, the state amount, right? And so there were literally 100 individuals who signed up to testify. And it was a marathon. We heard from secretaries. We heard from Secretary Keneally, who's the Secretary of the Office of Housing and Economic Development. We heard from Secretary Theodoridis, who is the Secretary of Energy and Environmental Protection, Secretary of the Environment and Energy. We heard from the Secretary of Transportation, who all had really good plans, right? That were basically Governor Baker's proposal that he put out over the summer. And they said, this is why we need to do these things, right? They made very convincing cases. And then a lot of people from a lot of different sectors followed up, legislators, experts in their field, and the arts community showed up, right? So Executive Director Michael Bobbitt from the Mass Cultural Council testified. I testified on behalf of Mass Creative. There were a number of arts and cultural organizations who testified with some really great ideas about specific project funding for their organizations. But what Michael and I, and then Chair Edward Kennedy of Lowell, who's the chair of the Tourism, Arts and Cultural Development Committee, well, the three of us all talked about, it can't be about like small projects, one-time projects that go to one organization. It needs to be about a recovery strategy for the entire sector. And we leaned really heavily into that special COVID-19 Cultural Impact Commission report, right? We've talked about that report before. The report's big headline is that at minimum, we need $575 million of recovery and stabilization funding for the sector over the next 4 years, right? Which is the spending timeline for American Rescue Plan Act funding. And then specifically, I talked about how the first thing that needs to happen, the thing that we're really pushing for here at Mass Creative, is 375 million of those dollars to go to stabilization and recovery grants to nonprofit cultural organizations, individual artists and creative workers, and then for-profit arts businesses and performance venues, right? Like the whole sector has to be taken care of in order for us to survive. So that's the conversation. We definitely had, Vice Chair of Economic Development and Emerging Technologies on the House side, Vice Chair Ferrante chaired it, as well as Chair Lesser, who is the Senate Chair of Economic Development and Emerging Technologies, and then Chair Dan Hunt of Boston, who is the chair of that House Committee on Federal Stimulus and Census Oversight. The three of them chaired the committee. And what's great is that all three understand our issues, right? Like Representative Ferrante is super knowledgeable about arts and culture and the impact that it has in her district up in Gloucester. Senator Lesser is a former chair of the Tourism, Arts and Cultural Development Committee. And Representative Hunt is, in Boston, has an enormous plethora of arts and cultural organizations and actions that he sees doing good in his community. But they need to hear from us, and all of your legislators need to hear from us. So it's time to get loud. We've been waiting for this. This is the thing we have been like building towards for the last 2 years, right? So we need to make sure that we are sharing this message. We are talking about the need for American Rescue Plan Act state funds to go to the arts and cultural recovery right now. And there are a couple of ways that we can do that. So the first one is you can submit written testimony. So and I hope in the chat at this point, G has probably posted information about what written testimony is. So we wrote like a little special brief about like, how does testimony fit into this whole process, which I'll go over in a second. And then we included talking points. Literally, it's like a little talking points for you to write your own testimony. It gives information about where you need to submit that testimony and the deadline. And the deadline is a week from today. So by 5 p.m. on Friday next week, you got to get your written testimony in. And here's the thing I'm going to say too. So when a bill is introduced, right, like there's a couple of different steps for community and other legislative input. And the first one is a hearing. So every bill that gets filed gets a hearing. And so this is no different. This process is no different. And it's really important that in the hearing piece that our voices are heard. So yesterday there was a ton of conversation about the environmental infrastructure needs in Massachusetts. Very much needed. I have much more information about what overflow means and how that impacts our communities than I ever had before. But we have needs too, and it is our turn, and it's really our time to step up and talk about those needs. So in addition to testifying at the hearing, you can also submit written testimony, and the staffs of those committees will go through all of that written testimony. They will pull out salient facts, and they will share that with their bosses as their bosses are making decisions. And so that's why it's really also helpful if we're united in sort of some consistent messaging. And that consistent messaging is the Special Commission on COVID Cultural Impact gave you a report. You asked for a report from this commission. They gave it to you with specific recommendations about the recovery of the sector. And the headline is 575 million total over the next 4 years, with the first 375 million going immediately to stabilization and recovery grants, right? The other thing that's really important, and that I for those of you who watched the hearing, and I know some of you on this call did watch that hearing, so I was getting some texts, which is such a great feeling to be like, oh, we're all in this together, is that the personal narratives connected to the larger messaging works, right? You could see the legislators kind of nodding their heads and kind of perking up when individuals were talking about, here's what's happening in my community, and that's why we need this larger project to make a difference, right? And so that's why I'm going to call on all of you who are part of organizations who have sort of sustained enormous losses over the last year and have continued to deliver to your communities and connect people to talk about those specific examples, right? What does it mean for the last year and a half to not be able to really have the sort of packed houses in your theater spaces, to have to do a different level of youth educational programming, to have to just even do timed ticketing, and how you've seen attendance drop as a result? Because we want to be clear and say, like, this is happening and this hasn't stopped happening, right? You absolutely should talk about the recovery funds that you have received, right? And then you should also acknowledge that there's more that's needed, okay? I think a good talk, this isn't actually in the talking points, but one of them I think is really useful, is that that $10 million grant program that Governor Baker put together at the end of the calendar year last year, and that the Mass Cultural Council facilitated, that was $10 million. There was $30 million of requested aid. And we know, because of the way that the proposal was written, that a lot of people opted out from applying because they didn't think they could apply. And there were limits as to how much you could ask for. So we know that only a third of the need was met of those that submitted requests. And we know that the need is even more than that. We know that PPP loans helped organizations for sort of time, like limited time, but those PPP loans have been spent. And yes, the SVOG grants, right? Or the SVOG loans are starting to come out, and a lot of organizations in Massachusetts have received them. But there was really specific requirements in order to get an SVOG loan that didn't help the entire sector. And that's why we're asking for recovery funding right now. Okay. And this isn't just about you hitting send on that email or you writing that testimony on your own, which is obviously part of it. You got to think about who are the 3 other people that you can put into your head right now that you're going to reach out to and say, hey, this is happening and it's really, really important. Email your legislators. We set up an action alert that's very specific to this hearing that we'd like you to use. It's in the chat. We'll also send a follow-up email with all of this information. But this is a really great time to get all of your board members involved. And I see some board members of organizations on this call right now. This is your moment to step up, right? This is about submitting that written testimony, connecting with your lawmakers and saying, I'm a volunteer board member of this organization because I care about arts and culture in my community, but we're at risk and we need help now, okay? I'm probably over gilding the lily here, but I feel really passionate this morning about all of this, especially after that testimony yesterday. So that's not all, right? Our to-do list is never done. So that's what's happening on the state level, but then every city and town also got American Rescue Plan Act fiscal recovery funds, okay? And we've already seen some communities put together their initial proposals for how to use some of that money. Worcester, out of the gate, said we want to earmark, I think it's about $100 million for creative economy grants and infrastructure support, right? Boston announced last week that they've got some money that's going out to organizations and artists that's part of their American Rescue Plan Act. Boston also has a whole public process that they're going to launch into, that, the Create the Vote Boston Coalition is working on making sure that artists and creative voices are heard in that process. But as we talked about in that our ARPA teach-in, it's going to be the most successful efforts here are going to be when you work as a coalition with other arts and cultural organizations in your town to say, we are a sector that cannot be ignored. We have been directly impacted by the COVID-19 public health closures, and that's why we want to make sure that a portion of this money is used for our recovery, right? And this money is not fully committed yet. It is not too late, but you do need to move fast, right? And it's not going to be about going and saying like, hey, I want to know how to apply for American Rescue Plan Act local funding. It's about saying, as you're making decisions about that local funding, we really encourage you to include the arts and cultural sector in that plan. There you go, right? So we have a bunch of resources that we have lined up for you and that we'll continue to update and use. And we heartily encourage you to use them. If you have any questions, you should certainly ask. We are here for you. And slide. This is the one I felt so much shame about forgetting at the very beginning of our call. Local elections. So the city of Boston is having their preliminary election on Tuesday of next week, the 14th. In my town, in Somerville, we're also in the middle of early elections. There are many cities and towns that are holding their local elections and preliminary elections right now. So it is really important that we all go out and vote. If you are able to vote, if you are not disenfranchised from voting, it is imperative that you make sure that your voice is heard. So we have a link in the chat right now that is the Secretary of State's website. It will tell you, like, am I registered to vote? It'll remind you of your polling station, and then it'll also include for you who are your elected officials and who and what, and hopefully link you to local ballots so you can see who's running. And there is a ton of information around what those candidates are plan to do and what their platform and their vision is. In Boston, the Create the Vote Boston Coalition has done a lot of deep work to engage all of the candidates running for office to make sure that they are talking about arts and culture in their plans, and to make sure that art supporters have that information when they're making their decisions about who to vote for. The same is true in a couple of other communities, and so we heartily encourage you to take a look at that. And that's my whirlwind speech or time this morning. So as a reminder, this work is not work that we do in a bubble. In fact, I have missed all of you. I hope you have missed each other and these morning calls, these Friday morning calls, but we have to keep these advocacy resources going, right? Like, we have done an enormous amount in the last year and a half, but if we want to make sure that we can keep these gains moving ahead, we need the resources to be able to do that, to unite and support the sector. So if you're an organization who is a member or who is not a member of Mass Creative, consider becoming a member or renewing your membership today. And then we also, individuals, we hope you will continue to be members by becoming a sustaining donor to Mass Creative. And we will see you in 2 weeks on Friday, September 24th, but don't be a stranger. I believe G has just put mine and his email addresses into the chat. We try to get back to everybody as soon as possible. Apologies as if it takes me or G just a minute longer than you would expect, but we do see your emails and we are working to answer your questions, and we are here to answer your questions. So with that said, have a wonderful rest of your day, and I hope you enjoy the beginning of fall and the tail end of summer.